Good evening. Welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam show. Tonight we're going to do part two, American and Vietnam War with the dates and so forth. Uh, Basically, what you'll see is I did not come up with I did not put down the dates of all the battles and so forth. I kind of put that together, the dates of the things that were going on around it. So as we look at the dates, we can think in our mind, we can just remember that the war was still going on when all these other crazy things are going. I am your host tonight, Bill Dixon, with the Lessons of Vietnam show. I was in Vietnam in 1967, 1968 during the famous Tet Offensive. We are broadcasting from the international headquarters of Nissan Communications here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And if you have any suggestions or comments of how to do the show better, you see on the screen there my email address, dixonbill80@yahoo.com. We'd like for you to, if you feel such need, to call in or come in on Skype and make comments or tell us whatever you think you want to tell us. And the best way to do that would be coming in on dialing 919-518-9773. Or even better, come on Skype. It's a free service. If you don't have Skype on your computer, just go look up Skype and download it. It's Computers 2K Voice. Sign in with your name and so forth, and then ask whatever questions or make any comments you'd like to have. We're always looking forward to participation from our show. The next thing I want to talk to you about is the Veterans Crisis Line. As always, if you are a veteran or you know a veteran that's having a hard time, encourage them to reach out to this number. There are people there who've been through quite often what you've been through, a lot of other veterans, and it's easy to talk to a veteran, but call them, and I guarantee you somebody's going to be willing to talk to you and help you out. It's amazing just how sitting down and talking sometimes can solve a lot of problems. They listen instead of talking. So let's go ahead and get on into the show tonight. It's the United States of America and Vietnam War by dates. Is part two. And the first couple slides is going to be kind of a recap of some of the things we did the last show. We were on December 9th, 1965. The New York Times report that United States and ARVN forces, the ARVN, by the way, the South Vietnamese, have not been able to stop the flow of war materials from North Vietnam on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. As you see that note, the trail was not just one. Everybody says, well, why couldn't you stop them coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Well, because there wasn't a trail, it was a series of different trails. They went off kind of splinters everywhere, like a spider web. But and also you had areas where you see the trucks there, and they had the camouflaged, and then they had elephants. They had guys pushing bicycles. They had people just walking. They had people there all the time, ready to repair it. If we bombed it, they could have it back in operation in a couple of hours. Entire villages could live right alongside the road. And December 18th, 1965, the U.S. Navy established the river patrol boats, or as our Navy guys used to call them, PBRs, Patrol Boats River, for Operation Game Warden. And then he also brought in the Swift boats, which were the faster boats. But these were fiberglass hulls. They could take troops and fly through the water. They could go real shallow because it was a jet engine out the back. December 25th, 1965, Christmas, President Johnson ends Operation Rolling Thunder, making another attempt to get the communists to talk peace. Rolling Thunder was a big bombing campaign that started early on in the war, and they constantly were bombing different areas and so forth. So that's what Rolling Thunder was. And there's another organization that does a lot of work with the POW issues, Rolling Thunder. Some of you out there may be a member of Rolling Thunder chapter. Good for you, and appreciate what you're doing. On December 31st, 1965, the U.S. troop strength had reached 185,000 men and women. January 12th, 1966, President Johnson, in his State of the Union address, says, in Vietnam, the enemy is no longer close to victory. Time is no longer on his side. There is no cause to doubt the American commitment. And I guess the best way to put that is we're going to talk about a whole lot of hogwalla. or BS, because there's a whole lot of BS went on during the Vietnam War, and that's one of them. Okay, and one of my favorite people in the world. President Johnson resumes the bombing of North Vietnam on January 31st, 1966. February 1st, 1966, the 9th Infantry is activated to work with the Navy Riverine Service. You remember those PBRs I just showed you? Well, the 9th Infantry guys would ride those boats, and they would fly up onto the shore, and they jump out and go take care of the Viet Cong and so forth. So they were infantry guys, but they rode around on boats from time to time. On February 18th, 1966, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara says during a televised hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that, now I want you to listen to this one really carefully. It just irritates you know what out of me, just read it. The U.S. objectives in Vietnam are not to destroy or overthrow the communist government of North Vietnam. My question is, why the hell were we there? If we weren't going to overthrow the communist government who was trying to take care of South Vietnam. If they'd get out of South Vietnam, we wouldn't have to worry about overthrowing. Anyway, let's move right along by Mr. Robert McNamara. He did the whole war by computers, by the way. If his slide rule in his computer wouldn't tell him what to do, he didn't know what to do. March 1st, 1966, Senator Wayne Morse loses an attempt to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution by a vote of 92-5. If you remember that the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is what got us officially into the Vietnam War. But the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was brought about by an event that didn't happen, but it was used to start us in the war. April 13th, 1966, the Viet Cong attacked Tan Son Nhut Airport at Saigon. That used to be right on the edge of Saigon. Now it's almost in the middle of Saigon. There were 140 Americans and South Vietnamese casualties, along with 12 helicopters destroyed. It's a big place. We had dogs and so forth there and guards, but the sappers came in very quietly, crawling through the wires and so forth. And by the time they realized they were there, they took care of the dog and the guard that they came across. On May 2nd, 1966, McNamara reports that the North Vietnamese are infiltrating as many as 4,500 soldiers a month in South Vietnam. Now, that's 4,500 soldiers coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to fight in the South. That's a lot of men if you look at that at a month. A lot of men coming down. And those men are trained. We're not talking about guerrillas, the Viet Cong. We're talking about hardcore NVA, North Vietnamese Army regulars who have basically training just like our soldiers did and the nice weapons and so forth. June 4th, 1966. A 3-page anti-war piece signed by 6,400 teachers and professors is printed in the New York Times. See, we haven't talked a whole lot about the protesters up to now, but they're going full steam now. July 29th, 1966, Operation Rolling Thunder continues, and the U.S. ends its self-imposed bombing restrictions and bombs oil depots, ammunition, and weapon warehouses around Hanoi and Haiphong Harbor. In other words, up until that time, we wouldn't bomb anything in North Vietnam because I think we were scared of the Chinese and so forth. We could have bombed the dike around Hanoi and ended the war a whole lot because they were well below sea level, kind of like New Orleans, if you remember when they flooded. August 9th, 1966, American jets accidentally attacked 2 South Vietnamese villages, killing 63 villagers and wounded over 100. As any war, there's a lot of what they call friendly fire. And I tell you what, if it's coming at you, there ain't nothing friendly about it. It may be coming from friendlies, but it ain't friendly if it's coming at you. August 30th, 1966, North Vietnam's communist regime announces it will be receiving economic and technical assistance from China. It was nice of them to announce it since they'd already been doing that. Okay. September 1st, 1966, French President Charles de Gaulle calls for American and I left the end off, and Allied troops to withdraw from Vietnam. Now, I think it's really funny that the president of France tells us we need to pull out because we financed his war for almost 10 years 80% of it or so while he was there. Now he says we should pull out. September 23rd, is announced by American forces that the jungle near the DMZ, that's the demilitarized zone, the area between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. You can see North Vietnam is the red and South Vietnam is the dark green, and then that little light green with the arrow going to it, that is the DMZ. They decided to start spraying Agent Orange and Agent Blue and black and white and pink and so forth to take care of the vegetation. October 3rd, 1966, the Soviet Union makes the announcement that they will provide military as well as economic aid to North Vietnam. So now we got the two biggest communist countries in the world who said they're going to look after poor little old North Vietnam. In October 26, 1966, President Johnson visits U.S. troops at Cam Ranh Bay in South Vietnam. And you see that long arrow there. Cam Ranh Bay, I understand, was almost like being stateside. It was a huge, huge base. Kept pretty safe most of the time. I'm certain even they had rockets and so forth from time to time. Okay. November 7th, 1966, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara is confronted by student protesters at Harvard. They didn't like the way he was training the war. We didn't like the way he was treating the war either. November 12th, 1966, the New York Times has a report that 40% of U.S. economic aid sent to Vietnam ends up on the black market. And folks, from my point of view, I would be willing to bet you there was more than that. Okay, because a lot of times if you want to get a fresh uniform, you can go to black market and get it a whole lot faster. You can get it from supply. About anything you wanted, you can go to Saigon and get. I mean, anything. December 8th through the 9th, 1966, President Johnson's proposal to discuss the treatment of prisoners of war and a possible exchange, which was rejected by the North Vietnamese. And you can see some of the American POWs there. They marched them through the streets of Hanoi, right after a bombing, and the citizens threw rocks and kicked them and slapped them and so forth, and almost got out of hand. January 10th, 1967, in his State of the Union address, President Johnson said, "We will stand firm in Vietnam." We will stand firm in Vietnam. What does that mean? Okay. January 13th, 1967, The Arrogance of Power is published by Senator William Fulbright, highly critical of the U.S. policies in Vietnam. No comment. February 2nd, 1967, President Johnson announces that there were no serious indications that the other side is ready to stop the war. See, now while all this stuff is going on here, I'm telling you, the war is still going on. We're still fighting and dying in South Vietnam and North Vietnam. February 8th through 12th, 1967, all military operations are suspended for the Vietnamese National Observation of Tet. Tet is like Christmas, New Year's, birthday, anniversary, Thanksgiving, all rolled into one for the Vietnamese. It's big where all the families get together, all sides, north and south, always just said, hey, take the day off and we're going to go visit family and so forth and party hardy, and then next day we're back to shooting each other. So that's everybody decided, okay, we're going to have this truce. On March 8th, 1967, $4.5 billion is authorized by Congress for the war. That buys a lot of something. Not certain.
Back then, especially.
Yeah, a lot of beer anyway. Okay. On March 19th through the 21st, 1967, President Johnson and South Vietnam Prime Minister Nguyen Cao Ky meet in Guam. Johnson encourages Key to hold national elections. And if you get a chance to look at a picture of Nguyen Cao Ky, you ought to do it. Man, he was dapper. He had his uniform specially tailored to fit his body with that big scarf. He always had good-looking Vietnamese women on his arm. Oh, boy, he was dapper, but he was a good pilot also. April 14th, 1967, presidential candidate Republican Richard Nixon visits Saigon and states that the anti-war protesters back in America are prolonging the war. I'll go along with that one. On April 15th, 1967, anti-war protesters with nearly 200,000 in attendance demonstrated in New York and San Francisco. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke at New York demonstrations saying that the war was undermining the social reform programs. If you remember, Johnson's big thing was the reason the Vietnam War was not declared a war is because he knew he had to go to Congress and he wanted his Great Society program financed. So if you went to him and said, I need you to finance a war and I need for you to finance my social programs, he knew that he couldn't get both of them by. So Vietnam became a conflict rather than a war. I'm not quite certain what the difference is, but he didn't have to go to Congress and necessarily to get their approval. So the Great Society. But the problem was Martin Luther King kept his mouth shut for a long, long time because he was afraid if he went anti-war that it would cut out some of the social programs. But once he discovered that the social programs were being used up by the war, he started to speaking out. On April 28, 1967, General Westmoreland condemns the anti-war protesters, saying they give the North Vietnamese soldiers hope they can win politically that he cannot accomplish militarily. In other words, they can't win the war, but they can win the politics of it. And that's General Westmoreland, who was also a very dapper gentleman, always looked just like he just walked out of the men's shop. On May 1st, 1967, Henry Cabot Lodge is replaced as the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam by Ellsworth Bunker. On May 13th, 1967, 70,000 demonstrators marched in New York City in support of the Vietnam War. How about that? 70,000 marched in support of the war. That ought to replace that 200,000 against the war. May 22nd, 1967, President Johnson again calls on North Vietnam to accept a negotiated peace. And it didn't happen. June 1967, Private E1 Bill Dixon arrives at Benoit Air Base and gets KP right off as he gets off the plane. Later is assigned to 159 Engineer Group, headquarters company in Long Binh. Okay. That was a very important day. I can't tell you exactly what day it was. I landed there because we had plane problems on the way. It was delayed. But the war should have ended right there. I was there. But on July 7th, 1967, the North Vietnamese Communist launches a widespread offense against South Vietnam in preparation for the Tet Offensive. They knew the Tet Offensive was coming on, but nobody else kind of knew what they would do. So they started to having offenses to keep everybody busy while they brought more troops and stuff in. Now, on July 29th, 1967, the USS Forstall, while patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin, experienced the worst naval accident since World War II. An errant missile from a U.S. aircraft accidentally fired and hit and ruptured the fuel tank of another aircraft, and that just led to more and more fires, and it killed 134 sailors. A lot of damage and so forth. Friendly fire. Mm-hmm. Hot friendly fire, because the aviation fuel burning, and you can see them there where it's smoking, and they're trying to put the fire out and so forth. Now, that's just 134 sailors killed. How many of them were burned so much they couldn't work again or maybe died later, because that stuff would get all over you. On July 1st, 1967, in addition to the 475,000 troops already scheduled to be shipped to Vietnam, General Westmoreland asked for 200,000 more to be sent. President Johnson agreed to giving him 45,000. That's a few less than what he asked for. But let's see, we had 475. I've been 600. That was more than we ever had there to start with. That's a lot of men. On August 9th, 1967, the Senate Armed Forces Committee begins hearings behind closed doors on the influence of civilian officials on military planning. So that goes way back to when Kennedy was there. He had some problems with the Pentagon, so he hired McNamara, all these brain people who's supposed to be smarter than anybody else in the world to advise him. And so he started doing a lot of things without the Joint Chiefs and so forth. And he kind of told them, well, this is what we're doing, and after it had been done or whatever. And then so McNamara came in with his group, and they did all the planning and did a whole lot of, the military didn't have a whole lot of choice. It's like Johnson said one time that we couldn't bomb an outhouse without his approval. So they trying to figure out what was going on. On August 9th, 1967, Robert McNamara admits the U.S. bombing campaign is not stopping North Vietnam's fighting in the South. So rolling thunder won't working. I declare. August 18th, 1967, Ronald Reagan, the governor of California at that time, calls for the U.S. to pull out of South Vietnam because it was difficult to win a war when too many qualified targets have been put off limits to bombing. As I mentioned to you before, if the American planes were going into North Vietnam and they saw a MiG, communist MiG airplane on the ground, they could not shoot that plane until it was in the air. If the Americans were going to bomb North Vietnam and they saw a SAM missile site under construction, they could not bomb that site until it was operational. In other words, until they shoot at me, I can't shoot back at them. Rules of engagement. We bombed a lot of open rice paddies in the process of the war. August 21st, 1967, 2 U.S. planes are shot down after the planes accidentally strayed into China while bombing North Vietnam along the border. You got to see, there ain't no line on the ground going, that's the border. It all looks alike, and it's an invisible line there, and evidently the planes they could have gotten close, not over. Nobody would have known one way or the other, but they got shot down. Of course, nothing ever came of that because we didn't want to make China mad. September 1st, 1967, North Vietnamese Prime Minister Van Dong vows that North Vietnam will continue to fight because all they had to worry about was replacing bodies. And they didn't seem to have a whole lot of problems with that because they were just drafting guys right and left. They didn't have to worry about protesters as much and so forth. September 3rd, 1967, Nguyen Van Thu is elected president of South Vietnam, and Nguyen Cao Ky is vice president. They won by only 35% of the vote. Wasn't exactly a landslide. Thu had some problems with some Buddhists in the past. October 5th, 1967, Hanoi accuses the United States of hitting a school in North Vietnam with anti-personnel bombs. But see, guys, let me tell you a little secret. Whenever we were going to bomb North Vietnam, we always told the Swiss that they could tell Hanoi that we were coming, and so they could get the kids out of the school so they wouldn't get bombed. But evidently they didn't pay attention and didn't get them out that day. It's a terrible tragedy, but war is a terrible tragedy in itself, and it's terrible that it happened. October 23rd to 21st through 23rd, 55,000 people march on the Pentagon to protest in the war. Okay. On November 1st, 1967, President Johnson makes another offer to North Vietnam to discuss, and I got discuss, peace. The offer was rejected. My proofreading needs proofreading. I know, but that's when I got 3. November 17th, 1967, after briefing by his key advisor, President Johnson goes on TV and tells the people, we are inflicting greater losses than we're taking. We are making progress. Now, what does that mean? That means we're killing more of them than they are killing of us, but there are more of them. November 29th, 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara announces his resignation, about 3 years too late. Okay. December 4th, 1967, 4 days of demonstration by anti-war protesters began in New York City with 585 people arrested. December 23rd, 1967, President Johnson makes his last trip to Vietnam. As you see there at Christmas time, he's pinning a Purple Heart on the guy in the hospital, and I believe that's Nguyen Cao Ky standing beside him and the nurse. On January 21st, 1968, the North Vietnamese began their 77-day siege of the U.S. base Khe Sanh, located near the Laotian border in the DMZ. 20,000 communist forces surrounded the 5,000 U.S. Marines. Johnson is reported to have made the comment that he did not want another damn Dien Bien Phu, because Dien Bien Phu is when they wiped out the French. And if you see the push pin right there, that shows you where Khe Sanh is, the 77 days. On the time, all the magazines from New York and the newspapers always showed the Marines down in a hole someplace, but they shot back at just as much as they got shot at. But guess what happens when it's all over with? They all leave. The United States forces says, "Okay, we leave now." How many men died? And then he just up and left. Okay, moving along. January 25th, 1966, 4 Corps. Now, Vietnam was listed in four corps. Up around the DMZ was 1, Saigon was 3, and below Saigon and down in the real Delta area was 4. Warns that during the upcoming Tet holiday ceasefire, the Viet Cong were expected to resupply and move into position for a post-Tet assault. The key to that word was post. On January 31st, 1968, the Tet ceasefire was broken when the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops launched their massive attacks on the major U.S. bases, 36 provincial capitals, 5 cities, 34 district capitals, and several hamlets all over South Vietnam. The communist plan was that the civilian population of South Vietnam would join them. Now, I went the week before that, I went to Hawaii to meet my wife, and as I was going to Thompson Air Base to get on the plane, the guy was riding with me. He and I mentioned how all the funeral carts were. The Buddhist funeral carts looked like surface wagons. And in fact, I took a picture of some of them. And I found out later that was how they're getting the communists and their weapons into Saigon. They were bringing them in on funeral carts by the cartloads. So that was the start of the Tet. And a lot of things went on. It took a while to get everybody out, but it was a massive defeat for North Vietnam. Okay. January 31st to March 2nd, 1968, U.S. Marines and Vietnamese troops counterattacked the communists in Hue. Hue was the former imperial city, with bloody door-to-door fighting, and recaptured the city. While the communists occupied the city, they executed over 3,000 Vietnamese enemies of the people. If you were a school teacher, if you had education, they would round you up and kill you, because they didn't want anybody that would understand communism, how bad it was, so they killed them. On January 31st through March 7th, 1968, the Tet battle in Saigon is won by U.S. and South Vietnamese troops. As you see down there in that picture, that is a hole that was blown in the wall of the American embassy. Now, the news media were saying that the Viet Cong had gone into the embassy and took over the embassy. That is an outright lie. The Viet Cong did blow a hole in the embassy wall, but they never got out of the courtyard before they were killed, except for the 1 or 2, I think it's 1 they captured. But they never got in the embassy. They were killed before they got there, in spite of what Walter Cronkite and some of the other people said. Okay. Ah, yes, the famous picture. Went all over the news. It went out all over the world, just like a flash of light. On February 1st, 1968, a picture taken by Eddie Adams captured the exact moment that General Nguyen Ngoc Loong, Saigon's chief of police, shoots a Viet Cong in the head. This picture, with no explanation, appeared all over the world, causing many Americans to question the legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government. Now, I'm going to take a second to tell you about this picture. In fact, Eddie Adams used to come back to the general there and apologize for years about taking this picture. This guy is a guy that the general knew. This guy was caught at a mass grave of Saigon policemen and their families. They caught him red-handed, killing their fellow policemen and their families. and a battle is going on, and there's no way to take a prisoner. So under all those circumstances, I thought the general did a pretty good job of just taking care of him instead of shooting him 4 or 5 times. But it went all over the world. You could actually see, they actually filmed it, and you could see the side of his head go off. But that was a picture that needed a lot of explanation. A lot of the picture was taken about the Vietnam War, needed a little explanation so you'd understand it. It was still bad, but folks, if you hadn't noticed, war is bad, okay? February 2nd, 1968, President Johnson tells the American people the North Vietnamese Tet Offensive was a complete failure. Tet is in fact a complete victory for the United States, but strategically it leads to a drastic decline in public support for the war. See, all this time, McNamara and Johnson had been telling everybody how wonderful everything was going, and they didn't realize that the wonderful was not exactly as wonderful as they were saying it was. So when they mounted all this attacks and so forth, they were going, well, where do they get all these people if we're doing so well? Even though we did we basically wiped out the Viet Cong as a fighting unit there. On February 27, 1968, Walter Cronkite, news anchor for CBS Evening News, and he was listed as the most trusted man in America. In his broadcast, he says, "We have too often been disappointed by the optimism of the American leaders to have faith any longer in the silver linings they find in the darkest clouds." Now, I kind of agree with that part. The bloody experiment of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. After watching Concrete's broadcast, Lyndon Baines Johnson was quoted as saying, "That's it. If I've lost Concrete, I've lost Middle America." We won't go any farther on that one. February 28, 1968, General Errol Wheeler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on behalf of General Westmoreland, asked President Johnson for an additional 206,000 troops and to mobilize the U.S. reserve units. Boy, that would have gone over well, all the reserve units. Now, they did get some of them. Clark Clifford replaces Robert McNamara as Secretary of Defense in March 1st, 1968. I guess that gave McNamara time to write his books. On March 10th, 1968, news that General Westmoreland's request for additional troops is exposed by the New York Times. In other words, they were trying to keep it quiet. Secretary of State Dean Rusk is brought before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and is questioned for 2 days about the quest and the overall war effort. They want to know just how it was going over there. Okay. On March 28th, it's amazing the sneak things going on behind the scenes. On March 28th, 1968, Senator Robert Kennedy offers President Johnson a confidential proposal to agree to stay out of the race for president if the president would renounce his current war strategy and appoint a committee, including Kennedy, to put together a new strategy for the Vietnam War. Johnson rejects the offer. On March 16, 1968, Kennedy announces as a candidate for the presidency. On March 16, 1968, approximately 300 Vietnamese civilians were killed in a village called My Lai or Pinkville by American soldiers. This action was concealed by the Army for a year. This was a terrible tragedy. It should not have happened. The leadership was not there, but there was a lot of upper echelon officers that kind of helped create this, and they walked away free. But the Army tried to keep it secret for a long time until it finally came out. Okay. March 23rd, 1968, General Wheeler informed General Westmoreland that the 206,000 soldiers he had asked for was reduced by the president to 13,500. That's hard to scratch in the bucket there. Westmoreland was also told to tell South Vietnamese government that they needed to step up their own effort. In other words, as Johnson originally said, we're going to let them Asian boys fight their war before we took over. March 26, 1968, Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford convened a meeting of a group called the Wise Men, made up of 12 senior statesmen and military. They gave President Johnson a very bleak report on the prospect of victory in Vietnam. On March 31st, 1968, President Johnson, in a speech to the nation, ends with a shocking statement. I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. Now, is that because we're losing the war, or he just wore out, but the people going, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today out there, the protesters? Okay. Now, on April 4th, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in Memphis, Tennessee by a sniper by the name of James Earl Ray. This causes racial unrest throughout the United States. In the big cities, they were burning the buildings down and so forth, as you can see there with the headlines. On April 8, 1968, the Khe Sanh siege by North Vietnamese on the American bases comes to an end. They started just before the Tet, and some of the idea was to pull the Americans away up to Khe Sanh so there would be less of them down in South Vietnam, south to fight. On April 23rd through the 30th, 1968, the Students for a Democratic Society and other anti-war activists seized 5 buildings at Columbia University and held school officials hostage. Now, we got a lot of things going on in this country right now. We got a lot of protests, but so far we haven't taken over a building or burned any buildings that I know of or taken anybody hostage. So you folks out there saying, boy, it's this bad right now. It evidently not as bad right now as it has been in this country, okay? On May 5th, 1968, the North Vietnamese Communists launched a series of rocket and mortar attacks on 119 cities and military installations. This was called Mini-Tet. Now, Paris conferees told to stop squabbling. On May 10th, 1968, Paris peace talks began and stalled. U.S. demands that all North Vietnam's military leave South Vietnam. North Vietnam demands that the Viet Cong be allowed to participate with South Vietnam in a coalition government. Presidential candidate Richard Nixon secretly discusses with North Vietnam and South Vietnam they would get a much better deal if they wait until he is elected president. They argued about the shape of the table. They argued about who sit where. They come up with everything in the world to argue about rather than talk peace. It was just a big show. Okay. June 5th, 1968, just after Robert Kennedy won the California Democratic primary for president, he was assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan in Los Angeles. As you can see the picture there in the headlines with Kennedy, and you see Sirhan Sirhan in the upper picture. On June 1968, Specialist E5 Bill Dixon leaves Vietnam for home in Fort Hood, Texas. Okay, I'd done my part in spite of that. Yep. On July 1st, 1968, General William Westmoreland is replaced in Vietnam by General Creighton Abrams. Westmoreland is named Chief of Staff of the United States Army. That is General Creighton Abrams there. And for some reason, I thought he came in before I left because I thought we went to the change of command ceremony, but I guess I was dreaming. It's only been 50 years now. Okay. July 23rd, 1968, 3 American POWs are released by North Vietnam to a peace group. The 3 released were Navy Lieutenant J.G. Markham L. Gartley of Dunedin, Florida, down around the Air Force Base there, captured August 17th, 1969. Navy Lieutenant Norris Alfonso Charles of San Diego, California, captured December 30th, 1971, and Air Force Major Edward Knight Elias.
Something doesn't jive. They were released in 68, but they were captured in 69?
That's, I had a problem. I had 2 different sets of prisoners, but so that was a little bit in 71. They released three prisoners. I may have the names wrong, okay, because there was another date that had 3 prisoners, and I knew one of those guys that was released, so it got kind of, but let me point out to you, either way, if they were released in 1968, forget their names, okay? The rules were at the Hanoi Hilton and all the other prisons was you went by the chain of command. The chain of command said when one went home, they all went home. And they went home by order of capture. If these guys went home in 1968, I can tell you they didn't go home by date of capture. They went home because, well, I'm not going to say it because somebody come back and get me, but about the only way someone come home early was because they collaborated with the enemy. Now, I'm not saying these guys are name listed here did, but three soldiers that came home in July 23rd of 1968 were collaborating with the enemy and went against the rules. All the other prisoners and so forth. Okay, moving right along. August 5th through the 8th, 1968, Republican National Convention in Miami Beach nominated Richard Milhous Nixon, who pledged that he would end the Vietnam War as soon as he takes office. A lineup of tanks sealed off Miami Beach from demonstrators taking place in Miami. In other words, to make sure that the demonstrators didn't get down and look good and look bad on TV for the Republican convention, they held them off with tanks. August 26th through the 29th, 1968, Democratic National Convention in Chicago nominates Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Although he only won 2.2% of the delegates in the state primaries, which were swept by McCarthy and Kennedy. While outside the convention, police battled anti-war demonstrators throughout the city. Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley brought to bear 23,000 police and National Guardsmen upon 10,000 protesters. The tension between police and protesters quickly escalated, resulting in a police riot. September 1st, 1968, Vice Admiral Elmore Zumwalt Jr. is appointed commander of the naval forces in Vietnam. Now, when he first came in, the PBR's Brownwater Patrol Boat River, Brownwater Navy guys in swift boats were going up and down the rivers and narrow rivers, and the communists had bunkers hidden in the vegetation and so forth. So he ordered the spraying of Agent Orange to kill the defoliants along the river and probably saved a lot of sailors' lives in the process. But as we have talked about before, Agent Orange is causing all kinds of problems. As you see there, that's his son. His son died as a result of Agent Orange being sprayed along the river fronts. So he saved a lot of sailors and lost his own son in the process. September 30th, 1968, the 900th U.S. aircraft is shot down over North Vietnam. That's just in 1968. That's all, just under 1,000 airplanes already been shot down. On October 21st, 1968, the U.S. releases 14 North Vietnamese POWs. On October 27, 1968, in London, 50,000 protest the war. Even in London, they were protesting what we were doing. October 31st, 1968, Operation Rolling Thunder ends as President Johnson announces a complete halt of U.S. bombing of North Vietnam in the hope of restarting the peace talks. In other words, we've sided on the table, let's get started again. November 5th, 1968, Richard Nixon narrowly defeats Hubert Humphrey for the U.S. presidency. On November 27th, 1968, President-elect Nixon brings on Harvard professor Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor. On January 20th, 1969, Richard Nixon is sworn as President of the United States. On January 22nd, 69, he appoints Melvin Laird as Secretary of Defense. On the 25th, at least he got started fast, on January 25th, 1969, the Paris peace talks began between U.S. and South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong representatives. In other words, North Vietnam got it what it wanted. Okay. On February 23rd, 1969, the Viet Cong attacked 110 locations throughout South Vietnam. On March 4th, 1969, In retaliation of the Viet Cong attacks, President Nixon threatens to resume the bombing of North Vietnam. Notice the key word is threaten. On March 29, 1969, in a series of letters written by Ronald Rittenhauer, stated an investigation. It was remember, it was April of 1968 when Ronald Rittenhauer first heard about Pinkville and My Lai and what had allegedly happened there. Thus began the letters that he sent to several government officials, including President Richard Nixon, which followed was an account and investigation of the March 16, 1968 massacre at My Lai. Rittenhauer did not witness the incident himself, but he kept hearing about it from other friends who were there. So the government was finally, when the word came out, the Army was finally forced to investigate it. In May of 8, 1969, New York Times breaks a story of Nixon's orders to bomb Cambodia. Nixon orders the FBI to wiretap the phones of 4 journalists and their 13 government officials to find the source of the leak. In other words, that was supposed to be a secret that we were going to bomb Cambodia, and the word got out, so he put together this wiretapping there. I don't know what was legal or not, probably wasn't, but then the president asked for it. So, you see Uncle Sam's there, I hear you, thanks to unwarranted wiretaps. So we started wiretapping and find out who it was, okay? On May 10th, 1969, Hamburger Hill, better known as Hill 937, a battle between U.S. and South Vietnamese troops against heavily entrenched North Vietnamese troops. The hill was of no real value except it was occupied by North Vietnam forces. Attacking up a steep slope against entrenched enemy was difficult enough, but after the rain, it became almost impossible. But after 10 bloody days, the hill was taken by the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. As you can see the hill there, and you can see where the tree's been blown down, and try climbing that when it's just that red mud, climbing and it's raining, and they're throwing grenades at you and so forth. And whenever the bombing, we bombed it, they got down in those trenches and so forth, and the communists were well protected during the bombing and so forth, and as soon as the bombing was over, they start shooting again. The taking of Hill 937 cost the United States 70 KNI and 372 wounded. Some of these were KI, were from friendly fire, airplane dropping bombs. Having no strategic value, the U.S. troops left the hill on 5 June 1969 and abandoned it to the NVA so if they wanted, they could just walk back in and take it over with no effort. Now, how do you think the guys, the friends, and the families of those 70 KIA felt when, okay, we leave now? Well, why did we take it? Why did we lose those people? We're going to turn around and give it back to them. Folks, that's called the Vietnam War. May 4th, 1969, in a TV address, President Nixon announces his peace plan for the U.S. and North Vietnam. Simultaneously, to withdraw from South Vietnam, the plan was rejected by North Vietnam. In other words, they were supposed to pull out, we were supposed to pull out, and North Vietnam said no. June 8th, 1969, American forces in Vietnam peaked at 540,000. President Nixon, this is the guy who's going to end the war. President Nixon met with South Vietnam's President Nguyen Van Thu on Midway Island. During this meeting, Nixon told Thu about his Vietnamization plan. This plan was to expand, equip, and training South Vietnamese troops to take on more of the combat roles. As the South Vietnamese forces were trained, U.S. forces would begin withdrawal of the first 25,000. This withdrawal was for ground troops, but not affect air support. In other words, we're going to pull out the infantry guys as the Vietnamese started taking over and taking the brown water boats and everything else off, but we still had air support and so forth. Now, for some strange reason, in June 27th, 1969, Life magazine published the faces of the 242 Americans killed in Vietnam during the previous week. I mean, that had to be tough on the family, but let me ask you something. You take that week, the week before June 27th, there was more people killed on drunk driving accidents in the United States than was there. Why didn't they print those names sometime in their pictures? They were just trying to kind of like fake news, but it's not fake.
What they're doing today.
Kind of like what we got today. Unfortunately, those 242 men were used as a pawn in the propaganda of the magazine. July 15th, 1969, Nixon sends a secret letter to Ho Chi Minh via the French urging Ho Chi Minh to end the war. At the same time threatening to resume the bombing of North Vietnam if peace talks had not resumed by November 1st. Two problems there. If you want something from somebody, you probably shouldn't threaten them. And the other problem is Ho Chi Minh was not the leader of North Vietnam at that time. Ho Chi Minh was getting old and was feeble, and he turned over the running of the day-to-day communist government to somebody else. July 25th, 1969, President Nixon unveils the Nixon Doctrine. That advocates any nation struggling with communism to receive economic and non-combat military assistance from the United States. In other words, what we said, if you're a country and you want to keep communism out, we will send you supplies and we will send you bullets and all that sort of stuff, but you can't have no men. We will not send you men to help you in your war. You will have to do that on your own. August 4th, 1969, Henry Kissinger has his first secret meeting with representatives from North Vietnam. Now, we are fighting for South Vietnam against North Vietnam, but we're not going to tell South Vietnam that we're working on getting a peace agreement because they might object to something. So what are we trying to hide? August 12th, 1969, the Viet Cong attacked 150 locations throughout South Vietnam, right after we're doing all this secret talks. Okay. On September 2nd, 1969, Ho Chi Minh dies of a heart attack. Even though he had stepped down as leader of the communist government in 1965, he was still very revered. His death was a great shock to people of North Vietnam, and that is his tomb. It stands out prominently that today. In fact, I just saw a report not too long ago. They've had scientists come in trying to figure out how to preserve his body, which is entombed inside of glass case so that people can see it. September 16th, 1969, Nixon orders the withdrawal of 35,000 U.S. troops from South Vietnam. October 31st, 1969, polling data shows that 71% of the U.S. population approves Nixon's policies in Vietnam. It's got something to do with his getting the soldiers out. Okay. December 1st, 1969, the first draft lottery since the World War II held in New York City. The lottery based on birth dates was much fairer than the selective service quotas. When I went in my hometown, Wilson, North Carolina, that draft board there was given a quota, and they had to take so many people from Wilson County and draft them. And if your daddy knew the right people, your name didn't end up in that list. But when they went to the lottery, it was like going to a bingo game. The date would come up, and that would be the date, which would coincide with the number. Like number one may be December 1st. And if your birthday was on December 1st, start packing. You were number one. On December 15th, 1969, Nixon ordered the withdrawal of an additional 50,000 troops from South Vietnam. As you can see there, Santa Claus has got returning boys from Vietnam because Christmas present, December 15th. December 20th, 1969, Henry Cabot Lodge, the American ambassador to South Vietnam, resigns over frustration caused by the lack of progress in the Paris peace talks because they just didn't want to agree with nothing. February 21st, 1970, with the peace talks deadlocked in Paris, Henry Kissinger met secretly with the leader of North Vietnam, Le Duc Tho, in North Vietnam. That's Kissinger and Le Duc Tho. April 20th, 1970, Nixon announces the withdrawal of 150,000 U.S. troops. Now, on April 30th, Nixon has a new problem. April 30th, 1970, after General Lon Nol's coup against Prince Sihanouk of Cambodia, President Nixon announces an incursion of U.S. and South Vietnamese troops into Cambodia to eliminate the North Vietnamese sanctuary locations in Cambodia. This announcement caused a new round of protests. They found something else to protest. Now he's expanding the war into Cambodia. We thought he was going to end the war. Okay. May 1st, 1970, President Nixon calls the anti-war protests and students bombs blowing up our campuses. On May 4th, 1970, after a night of protest and burning by students at Kent State, the Ohio National Guard is called in to quell the violence. But things got out of hand and the National Guard fired on the crowd, killing 4 and wounded 9 others. This event led to additional protests countrywide. Now, the young lady that's squatting down there, she is not a student at Kent State. She's actually a runaway. She's a high school student. She's a runaway. She became famous, and she says that her in a picture taken has ruined her life. So all those people there protesting was not students. There has been some question about where the first bullet came from, but the National Guard guys weren't a whole lot older than the students, probably some of them, a lot of them the same age, and it was somebody had fired something, and it just kind of got out of hand, unfortunately for the students, but it's unfortunate for the National Guard people too. Okay. May 14th, 1970, during a protest against the Cambodian invasion fueled by civil rights in Kent State, 2 students were killed by police during the demonstration. On June 30, 1970, North Vietnam begins an invasion into Cambodia themselves. U.S. planes counterattack with airstrikes. Folks, we already had troops in Cambodia. We may have sent our South Vietnam troops in Cambodia, but we already had troops in Cambodia, the secret war. June 3rd, 1970, U.S. stopped spraying its defoliants, Agent Orange, Blue, White, Black, Pink, and some others. And as you see the picture there, the helicopter spraying it, how beautiful it looks until after it's sprayed. And then over here on the side, it says, "We came home and death came with us," Agent Orange. A lot of Vietnam veterans are dying today as a result of that spraying. To me, one of the worst parts is our children and our grandchildren are also dying as a result of that spraying. But it was stopped in June 3rd, 1970. A little late for a lot of us. June 24th, 1970, the U.S. Senate repeals the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin resolution that got the U.S. in the Vietnam conflict. They repealed something that didn't make any difference anyway because it didn't happen. But anyway, they repealed it in June 24th, 1970. I'm still trying to figure out, what did that mean? I guess it was a political thing. June 30th, 1970, U.S. combat troops withdraw from Cambodia. Those are the combat troops came in from South Vietnam. September 5th, 1970, the last official U.S. offensive of the war begins with our combat troops. On October 7th, 1970, President Nixon approaches North Vietnam with a proposal, a standstill ceasefire. All troops on both sides were to stop firing at each other and stand in place until a formal ceasefire could be accomplished. There was no response from North Vietnam. On November 20th, 1970, U.S. troops in Vietnam drops to 334,600. December 10th, 1970, President Nixon warns North Vietnam that there will be more bombing raids on North Vietnam if their attacks continued in South Vietnam. And I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick up the next show. Just want to talk to you about what's coming up. We're coming into November. There's several things that I want you to be aware of. This is getting to be a busy time of year, but there are many chances to attend veterans activities in November. If you're in the Triangle area of North Carolina, which is where we are, November 1st is a good day to celebrate. That's my 51st wedding anniversary. That's also the day that I leave and drive to Atlanta because I'm going to be in Atlanta for on November 2nd for a Vietnam symposium. There I'm going down to get some more information so I can give you better shows. My bride told me to get out of the house on our 55th anniversary. On November 2nd, after 32 years of running the monthly POWMI ceremonies on the state capitol ground, I'll be doing that ceremony at 12 o'clock noon On November 8th, I will be speaking in Zebulon at the Community Center at 9 o'clock. If you're in the area, come over to Zebulon, wherever the Community Center is, but I'll be speaking there about veterans and Veterans Day and so forth. November 9th, the Raleigh Veterans Day Parade will be starting at 9:30 downtown Raleigh. Look for the Vietnam veterans. I'm not certain where they're lining up yet because we haven't heard yet. But look for Amnon and his deuce and a half there, and go join him and ride in the parade and wave it as you go by and so forth. So come take part in the parade, so forth. November 11th, of course, is Veterans Day. There will be a ceremony by Vietnam Veterans of America, Chapter 530 at the Vietnam Memorial in Durham at 11 o'clock. November 13th, we'll have part 3. That's our next show, November 13th, and the final segment that night. And also, if you live in the area, the Raleigh Elks Club invites all veterans to join them for lunch at 1 o'clock on November 17th at the lodge off Millbrook and Creedmoor. Now, I'm going to ask you to do something for me. Being as 11th is Veterans Day, it's okay to tell somebody Happy Veterans Day. It's not okay to tell somebody to have a Happy Memorial Day. That's like saying we're glad those guys died. On Veterans Day, we salute all veterans. Instead of saying, thank you for your service, how about changing that one time? Thank you for your sacrifice. They're not servicing your car. They're not waiters in McDonald's and so forth. They appreciate your thinking on most of them. So thank you for your sacrifice. And we look forward to seeing you right back here on November 13th. Have a good Veterans Day and have a good strong end. We don't have weekends. We have good strong ends. So looking forward to being back with you and sit down and talking again November 13th.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.